Since for 80 years, two great powers dominated the world, the United States and the Soviet Union. Each country plotted its course with the consideration of, I am with the Americans, I am with the Russians, I'm neutral. These were the categories, and foreign policy of all these countries were clear. It is now 80 years since this system was in power. It's almost a century. These systems shift as the realities of nation states and the reality of the world shifts. It is now undergo, and usually it goes through a war. World War I, World War II, the Napoleonic Wars. We're not peaceful in this process. So we are now in a period where the World War II, post-World War II model is obsolete. It is not relevant to the world. That's considered the norm. It cannot sustain the world, cannot organize the world. NATO, Russia is different. Other countries are rising, India and so on. So the world is reorganizing itself. What occurs in this place is that each country has an internal crisis because the norms are being broken on all levels. I mean, how can you be friends with Russia? How could we be friends with Japan? How could we be friends with Germany? We've built both of them. So, and this was appalling. So we are in the period where people are appalled because it's not what they're used to. And all countries are going through this. The English, British are certainly thinking, what happened to our American friends? They know what happened to French friends. What will Germany now do? All the old questions are rising, but the new questions aren't being faced. The USA is not seeing the world differently. The world is different, and the US is taking note of it. Russia lost the war in Ukraine. The Russian army, the Red Army, could not defeat what is nearly a third world country. For 3 years it failed. This is a massive failure by the Russians. This changes the fundamental anchor of the world. The United States and Russia are not the same. Now, we lost Vietnam, but that was not as clearly important to us. So Russia's position in Europe is up in the air. Russia itself is up in the air. That means the world has changed. The difference is that the Europeans don't want the world to change. They're looking at the world and saying, look, we're doing everything differently. And say, you can't make peace with Russia. Well, if you can make peace with Germany, you certainly can make peace with Russia. What Putin has done has failed. What America is doing is taking advantage of that failure and realizing that the post-Cold War, the post-war relationships that led to the Cold War are no longer relevant. It's not what it's not what he wants, it's what he must do.
Well, I mean, speaking of the post-Cold War world and that era, some people are saying that the American century is over. Now, of course, that sort of depends on how you define the American century. Perhaps another way of putting it is what the British ambassador or former ambassador to the US said last week, which was the era of Pax Americana is over. Do you agree? Is the American century over?
They have been saying that since Vietnam. It's wishful thinking. The United States is by far the strongest military power. It is by far the strongest economic power. China made a good try, but didn't quite get there. So the idea that the United States, Pax Americana, is over means that no one wants access to the American market. No one wants American investment. No one wants an alliance. The reason we know the American era is not over is the Europeans are panicking over the fact that the United States is not there. So, in fact, what they're saying is the old world order is ending, a new one is emerging, and therefore anything can be said about what it's doing. The United States is organizing it, and this summit is a very important summit between not just US and Russia, but Saudi Arabia, the three great powers, the great power of the Middle East, the great power Russia, the great power America, are sitting down the same table and discussing the world. So this is a very different world.
And I want to come on to Saudi Arabia in a moment, because that is a really interesting question that you've been writing about as well. Just sticking with America for the moment, I suppose the question that people are asking as well is the idea of American leadership over as well as the leader of the Western world and the kind of unilateral post-Cold War world? Or is leadership just going to change the way it looks?
We don't want to be leaders of the world. It costs too much. It puts too responsibility. We had to be leaders of the world because the rest of the world was in shambles. Now the Europeans can lead the world. They can build an army. They can build an economy. Might even build a nation, European nation, but they can't lead. The point is the United States is leading. It is leading it in a direction that shocks everybody. But the world has to be shocked by the most important event that happened. The Russians failed in this war. Russia is not what it is. Now China has to reconsider its relations. One of the most important things to look at is that Xi made a speech last week saying that it is the private sector that must drive China, essentially abandoning communism. Now, that represents panic on the part of China. Russia is an enemy of China historically. It's now caught between Russia and the United States. So everybody is now trying to figure out what the United States is doing. That is not the end of leadership. Otherwise, they wouldn't be wondering.
And let's come on to China in a minute as well, because that is of course very interesting. I mean, let's drill down into Ukraine and what's going on there. I think everyone listening probably knows the story on the ground there. The front lines are broadly stalemated, although moving slowly westwards. The US and the West have been supplying Ukraine and now seem less interested, and at least the US is. How did we get to the point, George, where the US decided to pull the plug, so to speak, if that is what happens?
Well, wars end in victory, not negotiations, or in stalemate and not negotiations. What the US realized, this war was a stalemate. The Russians were not going to overrun Ukraine. Ukraine could not defeat. Only the Europeans thought that it was valuable because it helped the Europeans block the Russians. The Americans looked at the war and said, look, who are our allies? NATO is obsolete. There is no functioning in it. The Europeans are reverting to the pre-Cold War model of nation states competing against each other. China is a problem and must be isolated, but not so much of a problem. They asked the question, what is the fundamental issue between the United States and Russia? It was Europe. That question is settled by the fact they can't invade Europe if they can't take Ukraine. Now is the time not to deal about Ukraine per se. That was merely the example. To recognize that the balance of power in the world has shifted and reframe the world.